It has always been Sir Winston's habit, when Prime Minister, to have an audience of the Queen on Tuesday night at Buckingham Palace.
When the Queen and the Prime Minister are in London, they meet every Tuesday evening for a consultation on government policy, and it's there that a wise sovereign can exercise a very considerable degree of influence. After all, the present Queen has known 9 Prime Ministers, from Winston Churchill to John Major. The trouble is, we can't really estimate how much influence the sovereign exerts, because of necessity, this influence must remain secret. It's part of the essence of constitutional monarchy that the sovereign's political views must remain absolutely private. So it's not until the archives are opened in perhaps 30 or 50 years' time that we will know what influence the present Queen has exerted.
I've worked for a succession of Prime Ministers who have enormously valued the what they get from their weekly audience with the Queen in terms of very penetrating and shrewd questioning and expressions of judgment and view.
Harold Wilson was one Prime Minister who laid particular stress on the importance of his relationship with his sovereign.
It is perfectly clear that Wilson attached, one might almost say, inordinate importance to his relationship with the Queen. He really valued tremendously the hour he spent once a week in a private audience with her. He would spend a long time preparing for it. He would emerge from it in a state of euphoria. He had always had this feeling that people were getting at him and that they had designs on his position. And here was somebody with whom he could legitimately discuss all the great matters of state, but who could not possibly be after his job. And so I think the Queen, from that point of view, did represent somebody very special to him.
There is also, of course, a Republican tradition in the Labour Party.
Assembly sincerely to declare that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to a tax-paying Queen Elizabeth, but not her heirs and successors according to law.
But in general, the monarchy's relationship with the Labour Party has been remarkably amiable.
Be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors according to law, so help me God.
The Labour Party has come from an origin which it was seen back in the 20s, the beginning of the century, to be a potentially subversive organisation. And in those days, therefore, needed to establish, beyond any doubt whatever, that it was not a subversive organisation, and an easy way to do that is to show how monarchist you are.
One minister in Harold Wilson's cabinet had decidedly Republican sympathies when she joined the party.
As I grew more experienced in the political world, I realised, of course, that this country is not a Republican country. It's monarchist in a rather mild sense, but still very sentimentally monarchist, and that therefore it was political suicide to fight on a Republican platform. So I accepted the monarchy. And I have to admit that I came to admire the adaptability of the Queen and her entourage.
Prince Philip accompanied her, and Mrs. Barbara Castle, Minister of Transport, was there to see the great new road link put into operation.
Whatever they thought of the Labour government never passed their lips or even their eyes. They just treated us as though we were I'm a friend of the family who dropped in, you know.
This government of principle.
Since the 1970s, the royal relationship with the Conservatives, the natural party of Queen and country, has been rather more difficult.
It has eluded us for so long. There are those who say our nation no longer has the stomach for the fight. I think I know our people, and I know they do.
The royal family does not want anybody on the right or the left to rock the boat. As long as we all know our place and all do our allotted roles in society within the consensus that has grown up, the royal family is delighted. And the kind of anti-consensus, radical right policies that Mrs. Thatcher was introducing to make this a much more vibrant, dynamic market economy were just as anathema to the royal family as left-wing policies, because it produced the miners' strike. And instead of the usual British compromise and sell out and give the miners what they want attitude, Mrs. Thatcher said, no, we're going to fight the miners.
The first cavalry charge came a few minutes later.
In the climate of confrontation of the 1984 coal strike, it was to the Queen that the wives of striking miners turned.
We were getting battered to death on the picket lines by the police. Now, we'd heard in the press at the time that Thatcher and the Queen didn't get on. And a lot of miners' wives were royalists, so they said, I know, let's write to the Queen. Let's tell her how we feel. And we thought, well, at least we have one thing in common with the Queen. She doesn't like Thatcher, and we don't like Thatcher. So we'll ask if she can help. So we got this petition together, a group of Women Against Pit Closures, and we came, we wrote, and they said we could bring the petition to the Queen, and we really had a lot of faith in that petition.
Although some of us weren't royalists, we just had the image of the Queen being the mother of the nation, and as we were mothers in struggle, we thought maybe she would at least try to understand what we were trying to do. We knew that politically she wouldn't have any power as such to help us, but that she would probably pass the petitions on to government ministers, and at least maybe if they could ignore letters directly from us, then they couldn't ignore the letter once it had been passed from the Queen.
Though the palace did pass the petition on to the government, it is impossible to know whether the Queen really had any sympathy for the striking miners, because she is constitutionally forbidden from involving herself in such political disputes. However, 2 years later, the Sunday Times caused a storm when it alleged that the Queen was secretly campaigning against the government's policies. Its story claimed that the Queen feared that Mrs. Thatcher was damaging the fabric of British society and that her policy on South Africa might destroy the Commonwealth.
We knew that the Queen and other members of the royal family were worried and disliked the direction that the Thatcher government was going in a whole host of areas. We knew that because we were being briefed by members of the royal family and their surrogates themselves. And we weren't alone in that. Huge chunks of the British press were being briefed in that way. The difference was that I was not prepared to play the game to allow a whispering campaign like that against the government to take root without revealing the source.
The Queen's private secretary took the unprecedented step of writing to the Times in his own name to deny the story, though he did say that the Queen had the right, even the duty, to advise the government. So it is clear that far from having a purely ceremonial role in the British political system, the Queen has both formal power and informal influence. And indeed, rather than decline, the political role of the monarch may actually increase in the years ahead.
There's a good possibility that we'll have proportional representation in Britain within, say, the next decade. Now, PR would very considerably affect the role of the monarchy because, after all, it would mean that almost every parliament would be a hung parliament.
As a result, the Queen would be actively involved in appointing the Prime Minister, not just occasionally, but after every election. If that were to become her normal level of political involvement, fresh impetus might be given to the campaign to do away with all royal prerogative powers.
First of all, we have to remove the royal prerogative and ensure that the powers of the Prime Minister and government are laid down in a proper constitution and made really accountable to Parliament. And secondly, we have to remove the monarch from the political sphere so that her role becomes a purely ceremonial and not a political one. Instead of the monarch having the power to decide who should be Prime Minister, it should be a matter for a vote in Parliament itself, and that the Speaker should, if necessary, decide who should be called on to be Prime Minister.
This is what the Queen has seen happen to her distant relative, the King of Sweden, now a purely ceremonial figure whose political powers have been transferred to the Speaker of the Parliament. Opinion is divided over whether such a reduction in the Queen's political role would benefit the Constitution.
Well, somebody has to take the responsibility, and the important thing is to have somebody who is impartial. And an hereditary monarch is much more likely to be impartial than an elected official, because an elected official, however lofty, is always going to be looking back over his shoulder at the people who elected him. So I think it's the guarantee of impartiality and fairness which commends an hereditary monarch in this situation.
I think you're in very great difficulties if people
say, well, election is a bad thing, because if you can't trust the people to elect a president, why should you trust them to elect a member of parliament? Why should you trust parliament to elect a prime minister? And I think the argument about democracy and voting producing bad results is itself, funnily enough, a product of the whole anti-democratic culture we live in. That somehow be better for somebody who was above politics, who we couldn't remove, having the job.
And with the loss of its political role, the prestige and significance of the monarchy might never be the same again.
I think if the Queen lost any constitutional role and was just a kind of decorative function, I think the monarchy would still go on, but I think it would be much less of a force in uniting the country. I think it would be like the nobility. The dukes and earls, you know, they're there and they decorate the countryside and they have palaces and all the rest of it, but they don't really matter to us because they don't have any particular function in government.
The greatest pressure for the kind of constitutional change that might affect the monarchy comes from outside Westminster, from Scotland and from Europe. Next week, we look at the part the sovereign has played in holding together the countries of Great Britain and how this may change in the future.